He was a giant of a man, feared by all. She was a desperate widow, fighting to survive. When he offered his help, she was terrified. But his quiet promise, "I will be very gentle," would not only save her farm, but also mend two broken hearts. This is their story. Anna Hayes's world had shrunk to the size of her failing farm. A year after the fever had taken her husband, every day was a battle she was slowly losing. The fences sagged, the fields lay half-plowed, and the leaks in the barn roof wept with every passing shower. Her only treasure, and her greatest worry, was her 6-year-old son, Samuel, a boy with a spirit as bright as the sun, but a body as fragile as a bird's egg. His persistent, racking cough was a constant, terrifying reminder of how close to the edge they truly were. Her last hope had been the upcoming harvest, but the heavens had turned against her. For 3 days, a relentless autumn storm had lashed the valley, turning her fields to mud and her hopes to despair. The final blow came on the 3rd night. With a groan of tortured wood, a massive gust of wind tore a gaping hole in the roof of her old barn, exposing her meager supply of hay and her only milk cow to the driving rain. Standing in the doorway, the cold rain soaking her thin dress, Anna felt the last of her fight drain away. She knew what this meant. The harvest was ruined. Without it, she couldn't make the mortgage payment to Bartholomew Thorne, the town's cold-hearted banker. Thorne had been circling her land like a vulture, making it clear he was just waiting for her to fail. Foreclosure wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. She and Samuel would be cast out, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. As desperation clawed at her throat, a name surfaced in her mind, a name whispered in town with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. Jebediah Stone, the mountain giant. A man of immense size who lived in total isolation on a homestead deep in the wooded hills, a place most folks were too scared to even approach. They said he had the strength of an ox and the temper of a grizzly, a reclusive brute haunted by some dark tragedy from his past. But they also said he was the only man for miles who could lift a fallen oak or move a boulder by himself. He was her last, most terrifying option. The next morning, leaving Samuel with a neighbor, Anna rode out. The journey to Jebediah's homestead was a journey into fear itself. The path grew narrow, winding through ancient, imposing trees that blocked out the Sunday. The air was cold, silent, save for the nervous huffing of her horse. When she finally reached the clearing, her heart hammered against her ribs. The homestead was as imposing as its owner. The log cabin was massive, built with timbers that looked like whole trees. But it was the man standing by the woodpile who stole her breath. He was a giant, taller than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle and arms thick with muscle that strained the seams of his simple shirt. He turned as she approached, and her fear intensified. His face was a landscape of harsh lines and a thick, untamed beard. He watched her approach, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat, his expression unreadable. She dismounted, her legs trembling, forcing herself to stand tall despite the instinct to flee. She explained her plight, her voice barely a whisper, telling him of the ruined barn, of her sick son, of the foreclosure that loomed over them. She offered him what little she had: hot meals for a week's work and the last few dollars from her savings. She expected him to laugh or to grunt and turn away. Instead, he listened in complete silence. When she finished, he simply looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were looking directly into her soul. He saw past her pride, past her desperate plea, and saw the raw, terrified exhaustion beneath. He saw a mother fighting for her child. Then, he looked past her, towards the town and the valley, a flicker of a painful memory in his eyes. When he finally looked back at her, his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. Then he spoke, his voice a low, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. But it was not the harsh growl she had expected. It was surprisingly quiet, almost gentle. He saw the way she flinched at his sighs, the way she clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking. "Do not mind my sighs, ma'am. I will be very gentle." The promise, so simple and unexpected, hung in the air. It was not the assurance of a hired hand, but of something else entirely. It was the promise of a protector. In that moment, Anna felt the first glimmer of hope she had known in a year. It was a hope tinged with a deep, unsettling fear of the giant man before her, but it was hope nonetheless. And for a woman with nothing left to lose, it was enough. Jebediah Stone arrived at Anna's farm the next morning as the sun was rising. His presence was overwhelming. He seemed to fill the small yard, his shadow stretching long and dark across the damp earth. Anna watched from her kitchen window, her heart aflutter with a nervous energy. Clutching a cup of coffee she was too anxious to drink. The single word that echoed in her mind was giant. Every rational thought told her this was a mistake, that she had invited a force of nature she could not control into her fragile world. But then she remembered his promise, a quiet rumble in the vast silence of her fear. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the barn, his steps sure and steady, and began to work. Anna had expected a storm of brute force, a whirlwind of chaotic strength. What she witnessed was a quiet miracle of control. He lifted the massive, splintered beam that had collapsed the roof, a timber that would have taken 3 normal men to budge, with a steady, focused effort that was almost silent. His movements were economical, precise. He was not a brute destroying things. He was a craftsman, building them. Throughout the day, she watched him from a distance, her fear slowly giving way to a sense of awe. He moved with a strange, quiet grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. When her nervous milk cow refused to leave the damaged barn, he didn't shout or force her. Instead, he simply stood in the doorway, speaking to the animal in a low, calming murmur until she, trusting the gentle giant, followed him out into the pasture. He worked tirelessly, stopping only once when Anna brought him a plate of food, which he accepted with a simple, grateful nod. But the true test, the moment that would begin to truly melt the ice around Anna's heart, came late that afternoon. Her son, Samuel, weakened by his persistent cough, had been watching the giant from the window all day, a mixture of terror and fascination on his small, pale face. A sudden, violent coughing fit seized him, leaving him breathless and crying. Jebediah, who was securing a new post, stopped his work instantly. He turned, his face filled with an expression of profound concern. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked slowly towards the house. Anna, holding her crying son, tensed as he loomed in the doorway, blocking out the light. She instinctively pulled Samuel closer. Jebediah stopped, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. He did not try to enter. He simply knelt down on the porch, bringing his massive frame lower, making himself smaller, less intimidating. His voice, when he spoke, was the quietest she had ever heard it. The cough, it is deep in his chest. My daughter, she had a cough like that. Pine needle tea, with a drop of honey, it helps to soothe the throat. The mention of a daughter, spoken with such a deep, raw pain, stunned Anna into silence. This was the first glimpse into the tragedy the town whispered about. This giant of a man was a father who had lost a child. He understood her fear not as a man, but as a parent. Following his quiet advice, Anna prepared the tea. Later, as Samuel lay resting in his small bed, Jebediah appeared at the bedroom door. In his enormous, calloused hand, he held a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. He had whittled it during his lunch break. He didn't say a word. He simply placed it gently on the boy's bedside table, a silent offering of comfort. Samuel, half asleep, looked at the bird, then up at the giant's face, and for the first time, a small, weak smile touched his lips. That evening, as Jebediah prepared to leave for his own homestead, Anna stopped him. Her fear was gone, replaced by a wave of gratitude so powerful it left her trembling. "Thank you, Mr. Stone, for everything. It was my promise, ma'am." As she watched his massive figure disappear into the twilight, Anna realized the town had been wrong about him. He was not a monster to be feared. He was a man carrying a grief as immense as his own size. And his promise, to be gentle, was not just about his physical strength. It was a promise to protect the fragile things of the world, a promise born from a father's broken heart. For the first time in a long time, Anna felt a flicker of something she thought was lost forever, a sense of safety. For the next week, Jebediah Stone became a quiet, powerful presence on Anna's farm. He arrived at dawn and left at dusk, his tireless work transforming the neglected land. The barn was secure, the fences were mended, and the fields were plowed with a speed and efficiency Anna could never have managed alone. A fragile hope began to take root in her heart. With a good harvest, she might just be able to keep the farm. Their interactions remained brief and practical, but a new comfort had settled between them. He would often leave small, carved animals on the porch for Samuel, who now eagerly awaited the giant's arrival each morning. Anna, in turn, would ensure a hot meal and a flask of fresh coffee were waiting for him, small gestures of gratitude that spoke more than words. She found herself looking forward to the steady, rhythmic sound of his work, a sound that had replaced the silence of her loneliness. She was beginning to feel less like a desperate widow and more like a partner. But their quiet world was about to collide with the harsh judgment of the town. Samuel's medicine was running low, forcing Anna to make the trip into Redemption Creek. As she walked down the muddy main street, she could feel the change immediately. The friendly nods she usually received were replaced with cold stares. Women who used to chat with her now gathered in tight, whispering circles, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and scorn. The news that the mountain giant was working at the widow Hayes's farm had spread, and the town's gossip mill had twisted it into something ugly and scandalous. Her humiliation reached its peak inside the bank. She had come to plead with Bartholomew Thorne for a small extension on her loan, just until the harvest. Thorne, a portly man with a cruel smile and small, greedy eyes, didn't even let her finish. "An extension? Mrs. Hayes, your account is empty, and your farm is failing. I hear you've resorted to unconventional labor. Perhaps you should focus less on entertaining strange mountain men and more on paying your debts." Laughter rippled through the bank. Anna's face burned with shame and rage. She turned to leave, her errand a failure, her dignity in tatters. As she stepped out onto the boardwalk, her eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall, she nearly collided with a massive figure. It was Jebediah. He was standing there, a large sack of flour over one shoulder, his face grim. He had come to town for his own supplies and had clearly heard everything. The crowd of gossiping townsfolk on the boardwalk fell silent as he turned his gaze upon them. Women clutched their children, and men shuffled their feet, avoiding his eyes. Thorne, emboldened by his own importance, stepped out of the bank. Well, speak of the devil, Stone. I suggest you stay away from this woman's affairs. This is a matter of business, something a brute like you wouldn't understand." Jebediah didn't speak. He slowly lowered the sack of flour to the ground. He then took a deliberate step forward, placing himself directly between Thorn and Anna. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply stood to his full, intimidating height, crossing his powerful arms over his chest. His gaze, cold and hard as granite, fixed on the banker. The silence that followed was absolute. Thorn's smug expression faltered, his bravado melting away under the weight of that silent, menacing glare. He was a man used to power through money and words, but he was utterly unprepared for the raw, physical power that now confronted him. After a long, tense moment, Jebediah reached back without looking away from Thorn and placed a large, surprisingly gentle hand on Anna's shoulder. It was not a gesture of ownership, but of pure, unshakable protection. It was a silent declaration to the entire town. This woman is with me. Her fight is my fight. Thorn, flustered and defeated, mumbled something about being a busy man and retreated back into the safety of his bank, slamming the door behind him. The crowd of onlookers quickly dispersed, no longer willing to meet Jebediah's gaze. In the sudden quiet of the street, Anna stood under the warm, heavy weight of his hand. The shame and humiliation she had felt just moments before had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of security. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt completely and utterly safe. She looked up at the giant beside her, and in his eyes, she saw not a monster, but her protector. The promise he had made to be gentle was a promise he had kept, but she now understood its true meaning. He was gentle with the weak, the innocent, the vulnerable. But to the cruel and the predatory, he was an immovable mountain. Tu yet veri, moilien min kahada du konkai kunko. Jurla lukti sovau kwa ku Jebediah, va kunko them moi kwan he tin kam kaha. De la gi doen 5, gi doen plot twist. No be mut duke teet low. The ride back to the farm was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer the awkward quiet of strangers, but the profound, shared silence of allies. The image of Jebediah standing as her shield against the town's scorn was burned into Anna's mind. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her struggle as his own. The fear she once felt of his size had been completely replaced by a deep and profound gratitude. She no longer saw a giant. She saw the biggest heart she had ever known. That evening, after Samuel was asleep, they sat at the small kitchen table, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. The unspoken questions that had hung between them for weeks finally felt safe to ask. It was Anna who broke the silence, her voice soft in the quiet room. She thanked him again, not just for his help with the farm, but for what he had done in town. Her gratitude gave her the courage to finally ask the question that the whole town whispered but no one dared to voice. She asked him why he lived so alone, why a man of such quiet strength would choose to isolate himself on a remote mountain feared by all. Jebediah didn't answer right away. He stared into the flickering flame of the lamp, his large hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The silence stretched, and Anna began to regret her question, fearing she had overstepped. But then, he began to speak, his voice a low, rough murmur, heavy with a grief that was years old but still raw. He told her his secret, the story behind the whispers. Years ago, he was not the reclusive giant of the mountain. He was a husband and a father. His wife, Mary, was a woman full of laughter, and they had a daughter, a small, fragile girl named Lily, who had a cough that never seemed to leave her chest, much like Samuel's. He spoke of his own immense size, how he was always so terrified of his own strength around his tiny daughter, how he learned to move with a gentleness that defied his appearance. His homestead was not a fortress then, but a home filled with love. Then came the fire. It started in the barn, a stray spark from the forge on a dry, windy night. It spread with terrifying speed. He remembered the heat, the smoke, the panic. He used his strength to rip the door off its hinges to get his wife out, but a burning beam collapsed, trapping their daughter's room. He told Anna, his voice cracking for the first time, of his desperate, useless struggle against the flames, how his own brute size, as the town called it, was powerless against the fire. He had saved his wife, but he was too late to save his daughter. The tragedy didn't end there. His wife, consumed by a grief so deep she could not escape it, faded away over the next year, leaving him utterly alone. The town, in their own fear and inability to comprehend such a loss, needed someone to blame. The whispers began. They said he was too big, too clumsy. They twisted his strength into a flaw, a danger. They looked at him, not with sympathy, but with suspicion. They turned him into the mountain giant, the brute, the monster. He didn't fight the rumors. Consumed by his own crushing guilt, he began to believe them. He retreated into his solitude, building a wall around his heart, convinced that his strength was a curse, and that he was destined to be alone, for fear of ever hurting someone fragile again. As his story finished, a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. Anna reached across the table, and, for the first time, she initiated the touch. She placed her small hand over his enormous, trembling one. In that moment she understood everything. His gentleness with Samuel, his quiet protection of her, his profound loneliness. He was not a monster. He was a father, a husband, trapped in a prison of guilt. Your strength is not a curse, Jebediah. It is a gift. You didn't fail her. You just couldn't stop the fire. No one could have. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with years of unshed pain, and in her gaze he found not pity, but a deep, unwavering understanding. She had lost a family to the cruelty of nature, just as he had. They were two survivors, two broken hearts who understood the same language of loss. The wall around his heart, so carefully built over years of solitude, finally began to crumble. He turned his hand over and gently, tentatively, laced his fingers with hers. The touch was electric, a promise of a healing that neither of them had thought possible. Jebediah's confession changed everything. The last remnants of fear and uncertainty between them vanished, replaced by a deep, powerful intimacy. They were no longer just a widow and a hired hand. They were two souls bound by a shared understanding of grief and healing. They began to talk more, sharing stories of the families they had lost, finding comfort in their mutual memories. A fragile, unspoken love began to bloom in the spaces where sorrow once grew. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. Bartholomew Thorne, the banker, was a man who did not take public humiliation lightly. Defied by the very woman he sought to crush and intimidated by the giant she had allied herself with, his greed festered into a venomous need for revenge. He would not just take her farm, he would destroy them both. The attack came not with fists, but with the cold, cruel power of the law. A week later, the town sheriff rode up to the farm. He did not come alone. Beside him rode Thorne, a smug, triumphant look on his face. The sheriff, a man who clearly disliked his task, handed Anna an official-looking document. It was a final notice of foreclosure. Thorne had called in a forgotten clause in her late husband's loan, a clause that allowed for immediate repossession if the property was deemed improperly managed or if the owner's moral standing came into question. Thorne declared, his voice dripping with false concern, that a lone woman living with a reclusive and unstable man was clear evidence of both. He informed them they had 48 hours to vacate the premises before he took possession. The world seemed to stop. It was a perfectly legal, utterly ruthless checkmate. Anna stared at the paper, the words blurring through a sudden haze of tears. After all, their hard work, After the hope that had just begun to blossom, it was all over. Thorn had won, but as she stood there, trembling, she felt a large, steady hand on her shoulder. Jebediah stood beside her, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had been silent until now, but the time for silence was over. He turned to the sheriff, ignoring Thorn completely. He spoke of the repairs he had made, the fields he had plowed, the clear evidence that the farm was better managed than it had been in years. But the sheriff, bound by the letter of the law, could only shake his head helplessly. Thorn's claim, however cruel, was legal. It was then that Anna, looking at the man who had shared his deepest pain with her, the man who had become her protector, her partner, her friend, knew what she had to do. The fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, defiant love. This was no longer just her farm. It was their home. She made her all-in move. She straightened her shoulders and stepped forward, taking Jebediah's massive hand in both of hers, a gesture of absolute unity in front of the sheriff and her enemy. "You are mistaken, Mr. Thorn. This property is not improperly managed by a lone woman." She turned to face the sheriff, her grip on Jebediah's hand tightening. "Sheriff, I would like to inform you that this is now the homestead of myself and my betrothed, Mr. Jebediah Stone. We are to be married. As my future husband and partner, he has every right to work and live on this land. Any attempt to remove us will be an attempt to illegally evict a legally recognized family." A stunned silence fell. The sheriff's eyes widened. Thorn's jaw dropped, his face turning a shade of purple. He began to stammer, to protest that this was a sham, a trick. But the legal ground had shifted beneath his feet. A widow struggling alone was an easy target. But a family, a union about to be sanctified by marriage, was a different matter entirely. They were no longer two separate, vulnerable individuals. They were a single, unbreakable unit. Jebediah looked down at Anna, a look of profound shock and overwhelming love in his eyes. He had offered her his protection, and in return, she had just offered him her entire future, a home and a family. In the face of their enemy, she had publicly claimed him, just as he had privately claimed her. Anna's declaration hung in the air, a brilliant, unexpected move that left Thorn speechless. The sheriff, a man who followed the law but not without a conscience, looked at the determined couple. He saw not a trick, but a truth that was more powerful than any clause in Thorn's legal documents. He cleared his throat, his decision made. He informed Thorn that under these new circumstances, the eviction was a civil matter between two families, not a simple foreclosure. He would not enforce it. He tipped his hat to Anna and Jebediah and rode away, leaving Thorn sputtering in impotent rage. Thorn, defeated and humiliated, could only hurl empty threats before storming off, his scheme in ruins. He had been outmaneuvered, not by legal cunning, but by a simple, powerful act of love and commitment. As the dust settled, Anna and Jebediah stood alone in the quiet yard, their hands still clasped together. Jebediah turned to her, his eyes filled with an emotion so profound it left him breathless. He was a man who had spent years believing his size was a curse, a force of destruction. But Anna, with her quiet courage, had just shown him that his strength, when joined with her spirit, was a force for protection, a foundation for a home. He told her then, his voice thick with emotion, that what she had said was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed. She simply smiled, her heart full. She replied that it wasn't bravery. It was just the truth. This was their farm now. 2 weeks later, they were married. The traveling preacher, hearing of their story, performed the ceremony free of charge. Their only guests were a few kind neighbors and, most importantly, Samuel. The boy, now healthier and stronger, stood between them, holding both of their hands. He was no longer just Anna's son. He was theirs. During the ceremony, Jebediah slipped a simple, hand-carved wooden ring onto Anna's finger, a ring he had whittled himself from the wood of a strong mountain oak. It was a promise not of wealth, but of endurance, of roots planted deep in the land they had fought for together. 1 year later, the farm was thriving. The fields were green, the barn stood tall and strong, and the house was filled with the sounds of laughter. Samuel, his cough now a distant memory, ran through the fields, strong and healthy, and Anna was visibly pregnant, a new life, a testament to their new beginning. The town, having seen Thorne's true colors, now treated the Stone family with a deep and abiding respect. They were no longer the struggling widow and the mountain giant. They were just Anna and Jebediah, a family. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Samuel play, Anna rested her head on Jebediah's massive shoulder. He was gently carving a new toy, a small, perfect replica of his own daughter's bird. He was not replacing his lost child, but honoring her memory, sharing her spirit with a new family that had healed his heart. I promised I would be gentle. You were gentle with my farm, with my son, and with my heart. You mended everything that was broken, Jebediah. No, Anna, we mended each other. And in that quiet moment, under the vast, starry sky of the west, the giant who had feared his own strength found his truest purpose in the gentle art of protection. The widow who thought she had lost everything discovered that her greatest love story was just beginning. They were a family, forged not from perfect beginnings, but from the broken pieces of two lives, pieced together by courage, kindness, and a promise, quietly kept. If you were moved by this story of healing and love, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us what part of the story you loved most in the comments below. Your support helps us build our own family, right here